sister cities who have remotely and far away from Bahir Dar, Ethiopia, Ljubljana, Slovenia, Vicenza, Italy, Gdansk, Poland, Miskolc, Hungary, and several other cities as well. We couldn't do this without our sponsors. We want to thank the Eaton Corporation, Swagelock, the Cleveland Hungarian Development Panel, which has been providing us Hungarian pastries. Everyone is so happy here to be enjoying them. The University of Akron, the Cleveland Rotary Club, our Lithuanian American community, the Slovenian Museum and Archives, the City of Cleveland. We had Mayor Bibb opening our conference and he was outstanding. And of course, we couldn't do this without the Cleveland Public Library, which is just such an amazing supporter in every single way. This year's gathering is a bit different. It's both in person and Zoom and hybrid. So we're trying to make the most of it. And we thank you for participating. Today, we have an incredible panelist, Professor John Grabowski. He is the Krieger-Mueller Joint Professor in History at Case Western Reserve University here in Cleveland, Ohio. Professor Grabowski's interests in research span the fields of public and academic history. He specializes in the areas of immigration and ethnicity. And if you ever want to hear amazing stories, just listen to Dr. Grabowski for a bit, and you'll learn all about the history of Cleveland and why we are where we are today. He is a master of urban history as well as public history and the fields of archives and museum, with a joint appointment with the Department of History at Case Western Reserve University and the Western Reserve Historical Society. He serves as historian and senior vice president for research and publications. In addition to teaching at the department, he also receives the World Wide Web edition of the of the Encyclopedia of Cleveland History and the Dictionary of Cleveland Biography, a joint project of Case Western Reserve University and the Western Reserve Historical Society. Today, Professor Grabowski is going to be speaking to us about the history of sister cities. In fact, why we are actually having this conference, what it means, what it has meant in the past, why it has been, and what this could be in the future. There is nobody who has as much of a command of what we are going to hear about today, nor anyone who I think has as much authority in terms of the work of the sister cities as someone who immerses himself in it every day in these relationships. Please welcome our wonderful professor, Dr. John Grabowski, who will share with you the history of sister cities in Cleveland. Dr. Grabowski, thank you.
Joe, thanks so much for that very, very generous introduction. Sister Cities program is really interesting, but before I get into that history, I want to talk about why Cleveland is uniquely qualified to have so many twinnings. We have 23 twinnings, 23 sister cities. We're the largest group for any city in the state of Ohio. So we've done quite well. And I think that reflects the history of a city that goes back to almost late colonial times in the United States, established in 1796. And essentially, it was going to be a city that looked like New England, people who had connections to England through their heritage, but mostly through New England through their life. But the amazing thing about Cleveland is it developed in a way that nobody expected at that time. And by the 1820s and 1830s, you began to see a diversification of population, initially Irish coming into Cleveland to help construct a canal that would turn Cleveland into a major mercantile city. And then large numbers of Germans, people who didn't really have so much of a German identity as an identity from various parts of Germany coming into the city. So by 1860, what had been a little outpost of New England was a community of around 45,000 people, and 44% of that population was of foreign birth or foreign parentage. I always say that's kind of interesting because if you were on the street of Cleveland at that time and touched somebody on the shoulder, they would have been born elsewhere, not in the United States. Many of them also came from England and Scotland and Wales. So when we look at the diversity, we can't really neglect what would have been considered the mother country sending people over. And as Cleveland industrialized, it became a major industrial power. By 1920, Cleveland's industry was the 5th largest in the United States, and the city was 5th largest in the United States. And Joe, if we look at that population at that point, about 30% of the population was of foreign birth. Another third of the population were the children of people of foreign birth, and another 35,000 people were African Americans who'd come up to the city. So in a little more than a century, we became one of the most diverse cities in the United States, one of the wealthiest cities in the United States. And I think that sets us up for this remarkable set of sister cities that we have here. And we can talk about that a bit right now in terms of, where do sister cities come from? And if we look at it, the first twinning, so to speak, globally was between Coventry in England and Stalingrad, the later Volgograd in the Soviet Union. And both cities in 1944 had been severely bombed and damaged during World War II. And so they declared they twinned, and that became a partnership there. The United States entry into this really dates from 1956, when Dwight Eisenhower sponsors a people-to-people conference at the White House, and that begins the whole thing in the United States. And it takes a while for the city of Cleveland to get into it, but you have to imagine why this program of sister cities comes up as it does in the 1950s. And we're looking at a world that is just recovering from a major war. It is a world that is trying to rebuild itself, to rebuild connections between people, and to prevent future wars. And so this conference that Dwight Eisenhower holds leads to the Sister Cities program. There are four major parts. Most people who are involved in Sister Cities understand it. It's about exchanges, if you will, connections between cooperation between communities, different communities, in four major areas: arts and culture, business and trade, community development, and youth and education. That's what it was. And so we're trying to build a world anew after a major war. That's what we're looking at here. And I have to say that I'm indebted to Dr. Pietro Shikarian, who wrote an incredible article for the Encyclopedia of Cleveland History on our Sister Cities program here in Cleveland. And sans Pietro, I wouldn't know as much as I do seem to know about the Sister Cities. But the Sister Cities program then really is run by the mayor of the city, and the mayor has to initiate what cities we're going to go into. And it's quite interesting, because the first sister city we pick up in 1964 is Lima, Peru. And that is under Mayor Ralph Locher. And Ralph Locher is quite interesting because he is Romanian in background. So you would have thought maybe Bucharest or something like that. But we're also dealing at this time with the Iron Curtain. And are you going to twin beyond this, beyond the Iron Curtain at that point? Countries that were under Russian Soviet domination at that point. And Locher, I would have expected historically, given his diverse roots, would have pushed the program even further, but he didn't. And the next mayor, Carl Stokes, had other issues to deal with. And Stokes' successor, and I think this is the key to understanding the success of the program in Cleveland, is Ralph J. Perk. And Ralph Perk is a descendant of Czech immigrants in Cleveland. He is very much what I would call the ethnic mayor. He's at every party, every event in Cleveland, not only catering to the ethnic vote, but trying to really connect with the people of the city of Cleveland. And so if I look at some statistics, and I'm going to look through a list here because I can't remember all this. In 1973, we started a program with Brasov, Romania. In 1974, Ibadan, Nigeria. In 1975, and this is really good for me because I'm half Slovenian, Joe, we twinned with Ljubljana. And that perfectly matches Cleveland because Cleveland has probably the largest Slovenian population in the United States. So what you begin to see is twinning or sister cities that are based on the ethnicities in Cleveland, but also on issues of where business and industry want to make connections, where we want to make cultural connections with communities. And so we go from Ljubljana to 1975, Taipei in the Republic of China, Bangalore in India in 1975, Alexandria in Egypt in 1977. This is all under Perk's administration. Holon, Israel in 77 as well. I know this sounds tedious and boring, but I think it's interesting to see where the city is going. The large Jewish population in Cleveland. Rabbi Abba Hillel Silver, one of the real figures in Jewish history, one of the people who helped create and set up the state of Israel. Interestingly, our sister city in the United Kingdom is Cleveland, England. And that's basically where Moses Cleveland, the founder of Cleveland, has his roots. So we have twinned with the city, small community of Cleveland. So we have that there as well. And if we have some time to talk, Joe, I have another suggestion for a twinning in England that I absolutely love, but we could do that. 77, Heidenheim on der Brenz in West Germany. And so that is it at that point. And then for the next couple of years, Cleveland in this time period, the 70s and 80s, is beginning to lose its industrial base, is beginning to lose population. Many of the ethnic groups are no longer replenishing themselves. There are new ethnic groups coming in thanks to the immigration law of 1965. Becomes operative in 1967. What many Americans expected that law to do was to enable more immigration from Europe, Northern, Western, Southern, Central, and Eastern Europe. And that happened for a while, but by 1977, the forces in the world that put people in motion, the push factors, had moved to the Middle East, to South America, to the Pacific Rim, and to South Asia. And so that begins the replenishment of, and the renewal, I think, of immigration to the United States and to Cleveland to a degree. It is under another mayor that the system really begins to pick up, because the next two mayors, Dennis Kucinich and George Voinovich, both with strong ethnic names, one would think that they would have pushed the program, but Kucinich was trying to reconstruct the city as it was falling down, and Voinovich then came in, and his plan was to really get the city back on its feet again. So George Voinovich's focus was really on the city. When Michael White comes in as mayor, that's when things change. And we get to the list again here, Volgograd in Russia. Now, it's interesting to have a break here because we're talking only about Cleveland. And by this time, Rocky River, a suburb, has created its own sister city in Mexico. And then if we look even further ahead, in 1988, two of Cleveland's eastern suburbs, Shaker Heights and Cleveland Heights, are trying to really find a bridge between Russia, former Soviet Union, and the United States. So they began a sister city program, and I think it's Volkhozh, Russia, that they twin with. So you can, if we go beyond Cleveland to our suburban areas, you're going to find more of these connections that go up. I'll read the list a bit more. Bratislava, Czechoslovakia. We have a huge Slovak community, and that's a time for that. Canarca, Guinea. That's a different one. Not a large population from that area. And then 1991, Segundas Montes, El Salvador. So we are twinned with El Salvador, sister city with El Salvador. And people will remember the crisis going on in El Salvador, the people coming over to the United States looking for asylum at that point. So this rings into that period as well. Oh, what can we go into next? I go into my list here. Lithuania, Lithuania, 1992, and Miskolc, Hungary in 1995. Now that's, I think Cleveland really wanted Budapest, but Budapest has already taken. So Miskolc, Hungary was here. And if we're talking about a large Slovenian population in Cleveland, our Hungarian population is equally substantial. And it was substantially replenished after World War II with refugees after World War II and refugees from the Hungarian Revolution. So it's a very, very vibrant community in Cleveland. Everything is quiet at that time period, and it doesn't really begin to rejuvenate again until Frank Jackson becomes mayor of Cleveland. And I think the last of the cities are quite interesting. Mayo, Ireland, and there's a real tight connection between Cleveland and Achill Island in Ireland. If you talk to a lot of Irish people in Cleveland, that's where their roots are. Ethiopia, 2004, Albania, 2006, Rouen, France, 2008, Vicenza, Italy, 2009, and last that I have on the list is Bet Shean, Israel, in 2019. So that's a quick list. And the question is, for me, yes, Cleveland has a robust ethnic population, and when the Sister Cities program starts, it is a large industrial city, but it is still going on, even though the city has shrunk in terms of population. Much of its industry is no longer here, but we still have heavy industry. And a lot of what Cleveland does today, as we all know, is med ed and invention and looking forward to entrepreneurships, creating entrepreneurship. So I think a lot of what we do when we look for sister cities now is to look for those factors that are going to make those four first characteristics powerful for us. They're going to build human connections. They're going to bring youth. They're going to help economic development. And most of all, they're going to include cultural development. And that's one thing I neglected to talk about. And that's, if I focus on immigration and business and industry and jobs, the other aspect of it is Cleveland has turned into a cultural capital. And it has been on its way to that for a long time. The Museum of Art, the Cleveland Orchestra, all the museums in University Circle, and all the subsidiary ones that are in Cleveland now. So we are doing a lot of cultural exchanges. If I have an open question right now in terms of sister cities, it's the fact that when this program began in 1956, direct person-to-person communication was something you did by traveling from one country to another. Our technology nowadays allows us to engage with our sister cities virtually. And I wonder how that's going to change things in the future. How many people will be going abroad to meet face to face? How many people, particularly after COVID, are going to be connecting as we're connecting today on Zoom? What is the future of it? My feeling is, and a personal thing, is that face to face is still the best way. Now, I would advocate probably for the cultural capital for Indian population as well. Yes, Deepa, that is exactly what Cleveland is for Indian culture as well. I'm teaching CWRU right now, and about 20% of our student population, both graduate and undergraduate, are international. And People's Republic of China is the largest connection, and India, I believe, is the second largest, and Korea maybe third. So this is what we're looking at. And I know Global Cleveland is into this as well. But I think that's an open question. How are we going to connect? And as I was beginning to say, the fact is that face-to-face is still the way to go. And I'll tell a personal story about this. I spent 2 years as a Fulbrighter in Turkey. And Turkey was a place that my wife and I had visited briefly. Living there and interacting with the people and the culture made all the difference in the world. We really had to be there to understand what Turkey was. And I think that's very, very important. So I think that's a brief summary, Joe. Maybe we can have a conversation on this now.
Thank you so much, John. We really appreciate it. John, can you talk a little bit about the timing? Obviously, the mayors who have been facilitating the sister cities, you think about it under the time of mayors Perk, Kucinich, and Voinovich. The Berlin Wall had not yet fallen. There were still people in the throes of totalitarian regimes. You think about when Mayor Campbell instituted the sister city of West Mayo. There's obvious. You spoke to the demographic considerations and the population considerations. Do you think anything else was going on at that time? And
well, I think you're absolutely,
why and when?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. When the quote unquote Iron Curtain falls and Soviet Empire dissembles, that is a point when you begin to get many of those capitals in the former captive nations, as they would be called. That's when you begin to create sister cities with them. So you see that happening at that point. What I find interesting, though, is when the earlier ones, we are looking at sister cities in, well, we're looking at Rocky River in Mexico and Lima, Peru. And this is long before Cleveland develops a large Latinx population. And we now have a strong Peruvian population, and our Mexican population is just on the verge of creating a cultural garden. So some of these seem to be foresight for me. Very, very interesting. The first sister city of Lima, Peru, the story is that the number of trips were made back and forth by a number of officials from Cleveland. This was a big thing for Cleveland at that point. And not that it isn't anymore, but it was fresh and it was new. And I think the discovery of communities that were not associated with large populations in Cleveland is probably the most interesting thing that happens with the program. Yeah.
John, one of the things, that Dr. Grabowski, I'm sorry, one of the things
John, please.
All right, thank
If
you.
you're Joe, I'm John.
All right. One of the things that, we're noticing is, there's a question around the world right now about the fate of human rights, of democracy, of minority rights, of women's rights. Whether we're looking at what's happening in Tehran, or what's happening in Moscow or Kyiv, heck, what's happening here in the United States, right? The questions about democracy. Yeah. And somebody asked me if I thought that the answer was more city to city contact, right? That national governments, rise and fall, but there's this relationship between cities. And I'd never really thought about it that way. And I'm curious from a historical perspective that you have and your own reading and things like that. What do you think is like the future of cities and the role of democracy, the future of cities and the role of governance for people? And do you think the Sister Cities program has any potential to help inform that or improve that in any way?
Well, I would argue that the Sister Cities program has huge potential there, and then we're looking at size. So if you're government to government, you're dealing with the largest part of your bureaucracy. Sister cities, city to city, I mean, you're dealing with the bureaucracy, but it's smaller and it is more attuned to what's going on in that community. I think, particularly in a city like Cleveland, you have council people and wards. So there can be, I think, a greater nearness to the voice of the people in that. It all depends on who's sitting at the top in the city and what viewpoint they take and how much they're going to feed back the real feelings of the people in the community at that time. I think that's one of the reasons I'm suggesting that, maybe one of the ways that sister cities I don't want to say they're in trouble, but they're challenged by social media. Because if I want to know what's going on in the streets of a city, let's say in Ljubljana, which is where my ancestors came from, Slovenia, I just Zoom with a friend in Ljubljana and we work things out. You get the news that way. So it's not filtered. So when you get it filtered to the top, I'm not indicating that that's bad, because somebody has to digest all these opinions and say, this is what our city's about. This is what our problems are. This is what our issues are with democracy, with women's rights and so forth. The question is how accurate that filter is. And of course, if you're doing person to person, you're only getting one individual argument. But I still think that those connections of people, it's like people who used to have pen pals. That was one of the ways that began in, before World War II and after World War II, where people communicated across national borders with letters. And that's how they began to feel how things were going. And that's in those letters, you could talk about issues of politics, provided there was no censorship. So I think it's a conundrum that you propose here. I think nation to nation, that's where the power is, but I'm not sure how accurately nations reflect what's going on in the streets of Cleveland, Cleveland Heights, Chicago, or anything else. And I have to say that, the situations that you're talking about have had an effect, because that twinning between Coventry and Volgograd, they have just broken it. Just found that in the Guardian today, that Coventry has withdrawn from that partnership. Is that a good protest or is it a bad protest?
Right.
Yeah.
It's interesting, John, because it's the state of the world, right? It's never the same, and every day it changes. And yet, so many people in Cleveland can affiliate with a diaspora. And you mentioned the cultural gardens, which are, an incredible jewel for not just Cleveland, but for Ohio and really for all the communities. How do you see the diasporas in Cleveland in terms of their engagement with their first home or their home of origin? Do you see that in your studies as, there's best practices, or do you just think it's part of an American phenomenon where we leave it all behind?
No, the diaspora always engages, and you can find it in many ways. And I'll put my historian's hat on here. In 1871. The Prussians defeated France in the Franco-Prussian War. And for those German-speaking people in Cleveland, that was a major event. And they celebrated it by putting up an arch in public square and having a 8-hour parade through the arch. And this was all people who had roots in Germany, German Jews, Protestant Germans, and Catholic Germans as well. And if we're looking at what happened in Hungary in 1956, the Hungarian community of Cleveland welcomed the people who had fled Hungary after the revolution. You see that happening again and again. If I talk to my Slovenian friends, they always talk to me about the politics of Slovenia and what's going on there. So there is a connection. Now that does filter out over time and over generations, but the people who have some immediate connection, first or second generation, are going to have some interest, and particularly if they still have family or relatives back in that country. They are concerned about what's going on. So yeah, it continues today. I mean, if we're looking at Israel and the issues that have happened in Israel and in Palestine, you're looking at Palestinians in Cleveland and the and Jews in Cleveland, both engaging and listening to what's going on. Those diasporas are powerful. And those diasporas, in many instances, they're the people who elect, sometimes elect officials, and officials are elected on those promises. If we look at the cultural gardens again, during the Cold War, it was almost the duty of every politician in northeastern Ohio to go to the cultural gardens to honor the captive nations at the cultural gardens. And they needed to do that because, yes, votes, but because they were hearing from people in the street. So those connections, they're vital. And if we're looking now at what I would call the migration patterns that have shifted to the Pacific Rim and so forth, yes, indeed. Same thing here. My students in the university here are even though they're temporary, they are engaged with what's going on, and they talk about and they put up posters, they do protests, whatever else they have the freedom to do that. So
it was interesting, John. Yesterday, we heard from the ambassador for the Department of State in Diversity, Inclusion, and Equity, Ambassador Gina Abercrombie Stanley, a Clevelander, Cleveland native, and just an amazing person and woman. And she told great stories. And one of the stories she told was when she's the longest serving U.S. ambassador to Malta, but she was staffing the first female-led delegation to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And when she was in the embassy, she hosted a meeting between for special teachers engaged in special education. And it was women and men. And it was the first time that they had been at the same table ever. Mm-hmm. Emails had happened, John, they had seen, probably one another in different forums and far away, with the appropriate cultural distances to that time and place. But it was really interesting. And to your point exactly that, one of the things it's important is to create a forum in which people can protest or relate or be, themselves. We got a message from one of our wonderful participants today, Deepa Rao, who we were emailing with earlier today. And Deepa has a interest, John, in the relationship that we have with the great city of Bangalore, India. Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious, John, in your experiences at Case Western Reserve University and the Western Reserve Historical Society, for some communities, right, like the Slovenians, maybe the Hungarians, the amount of people coming has lessened. And yet we go to Case Western's campus, we go to Cleveland State's campus, we go to the Cleveland Clinic, we go to Metro or UH. The Indian community is alive and well, thriving, and it feels, John, like it's growing. Yeah. And I'm curious if you could speak to that, because here's a situation of a sister city that feels like it's ascending.
Yeah, well, it is, the population is growing and nationally as well as in Cleveland. And there's several reasons for it. I could get into a longer history. But computerization and the rise of digital media. Basically, at one point, I went to a World's Fair and it said, I think 1 out of every 5 software engineers in the world is Indian. And as Silicon Valley and other places began to grow, basically, that's what brought many people over for H-1B visas. The other thing historically that we look at is the need for physicians, particularly after Medicare and Medicaid are created in 1965, which is the same year that the immigration rules are changed. It becomes active in 1967. So if you have a job skill that's necessary, you can come here. So if you begin to look at physicians coming into the United States, you're looking at Asian Indians. I always tell the story. My mother's last illness was at a place called the Slavic Village Medical Clinic, and her doctor's name was Madhu Reddy, and her nurse was a Filipino. And these are skill sets that the United States needs, that they come in and they build and they create the community. I could look at my class of 18 this year and I could break it down by international students, and it's the entire world is in my class. It's very, very interesting. And you see the same thing at Cleveland State University. The internationalization of learning and people coming over here. But we've become, more of a global community than ever, not only digitally, but in terms of job skills that are necessary and people moving back and forth. And the other thing we're still a global community, people fleeing and looking for freedom. And that's a critical point.
John, I have a question for you. When we had the true privilege that I cherish, when I had a chance to ride on the Greater Cleveland Regional Transit Authority bus down St. Clair Avenue and around Asia Town, and then we hopped over the bridge and we were on Lorraine and the West Side, and you talked about Cleveland's immigration history through the eyes of a bus, right, through the eyes of what many working Clevelanders see and students every day. But you were giving the history. So much of the Cleveland now is African. So much of Cleveland is African American. So much of our city is proudly Black and has so much of a Black leadership moment. Right, Secretary Fudge, Don Graves. We've got these Chantel Brown. We've got these fantastic leaders on a national stage that hail from Cleveland. What relevance do you think the sister cities has for African Americans? I was asked by a leader in Cleveland once if I was comfortable with my work, because the more successful immigrants were, the less successful African Americans were, which I disagreed with very respectfully but intensely. Right, it's not an either or in urban environments. But what do we say to people who are born in the United States? They might be African American, and we're talking about sister cities, and they may think, what the heck does this have to do with my reality?
Well, there's a sidebar to that reality, and we're looking at maybe if I can go back to Alex Haley and to roots, and what I've seen, and this has nothing to do with economics or job competition, but I think it's pride and origins, and what we've been finding is a growth of all groups, particularly African Americans, searching for their roots. And it's difficult because of the border of slavery, but many African Americans then look back to Africa to discover, to find a real root there prior to the horrible voyage into slavery. So I think the sister city, we twinned with Nigeria early on, and that's one of those issues where you can go back. So it's there, but I think the argument that you're getting into is it's basically if you bring in more skilled people from other countries, it's going to hurt people who are looking for jobs in the United States is an issue that we have to deal with. It's hard to deal with, but and it gets into, I think, a deeper historical question, because every time a new immigrant group came in, there was a fear that the immigrant group was going to take the jobs of the people that were already here. And that is basically a root of a lot of immigration restriction in the United States at one point. But the other root of immigration restriction is an issue of race.
Yes.
So race in terms of immigration law was not simply Black, but it was Southern Italian. It was Eastern European, sort of a view of the late 19th century that certain people, skin color aside, were different. Amateur anthropologists at that point broke Europe down into three categories: Mediterranean, Alpine, and Nordic. And where Nordic went to where Mediterranean and Alpine went. Right. So yeah, we have an issue of race, but we have people who have been in the United States since 1619 still struggling to find a way to make it in the United States. So we've got to solve that problem.
John, one of the things that you shared with me that I didn't know as a lifelong Clevelander was the and you were when you were speaking, and I was listening about I believe the act was called the Chinese Exclusion Act, and we were talking about the treatment of Asian Americans, of Chinese people, and you told me that story about downtown behind Old Stone Church and the Chinese community that existed there, and I'm wondering if you could just share a little bit about that. I believe you said it was the Tong War.
Yeah, there was the Chinese community in Cleveland really began in the late 1870s, just a small number, and particularly after 1882 and the Exclusion Act, there was really no growth of the community. But that area, there were two merchants associations, two Tongs, and they had a battle, and there was some violence, and so what the Cleveland Police Department decided to do was to arrest every Chinese male in Cleveland. That's exactly what they did. And that ended up in a major international flap in Washington, D.C. It got to the State Department. Some people argue that what happened with the end of the Tong War was that a Chinese neighborhood was basically urban renewed out of existence and then moved to Rockwell Avenue.
Right.
So we're looking at a variety of prejudices that go on.
Yeah.
And we can look at, all groups break down in certain ways. I mean,
Yes.
I'm partially Polish, but the question is, am I German Polish? Am I Russian Pole? My family from Russian Poland, or is it from Austria Poland? And at one point there was a kind of a snobbery that went on among Poles, that they were Prussian Poles rather than Russian Poles. So you pick this apart. But again, we have an issue with color in
Right.
the United States, and we seem to be working toward a solution.
Right.
But I think, I can fully understand the fears of people who are saying, well, if you bring refugees in to low-level jobs, I'm going to lose my job or something like that. You hear this all the time, don't you?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, John, it's interesting. We were lucky. We work with some fantastic refugee resettlement organizations in Cleveland, Catholic Charities, Us Together, USCRI, the Secondaries, Refugee Response, Building Hope in the City, Asia, Ohio, Neighborhood Family Practice. Just extraordinary organizations, in my opinion, some of the best in the country. And it was so interesting. It's so interesting to be when we were engaged with people coming from Afghanistan and how the public was interacting with us versus people from Ukraine. And as far as our organization is concerned, you're born outside the US and you want to make your way to Cleveland, you want to make your home here. How can we help you? Right? What are the ways in which we can make it easier for you to get a job, get a home, send your kids to school, right? Share your amazing gifts of culture. But it's interesting when you talk about racism, even within immigration, people from Afghanistan are looked at one way, people from Ukraine are looked at another way. We're not going to even get into the way that people in Haiti are treated. And, it's this whole situation of, the challenge that we have, the inequalities that we have based on race, and this country seem to permeate everything. I'm wondering, John, you've lived you are living such an incredible life and a full life. One of the things that you make reference to, and I've heard you talk about this before, is your experience in Turkey. And I'm wondering if you could talk about that for a second, because I have to imagine that it was life-changing for you. You're a kid from Cleveland, you're going to, a very different place, different culture. And what do you think that kind of cultural exchange, that kind of younger generation visiting, going outside of your comfort zone, going to a place where you have to learn different things, what effect do you think that has, not just on you as a person, but on the people that you encounter who've shared some of those traveling experiences?
Everybody that I know who has traveled abroad to countries that they felt perhaps mentally uncomfortable about have come back changed. Because the question is, who creates the image, who creates the stereotype? I have a chat from Deepa that I want to get into, but let me tell a little personal story here that in 1983, my wife and I were on our way flying to Egypt, and the plane landed in Istanbul to change something in, and there were troops all over the tarmac. It happened to be one of the coups at that time. And I got to Egypt, and I unpacked my package, my suitcase, and something was missing, my t-shirts. And the first thing I said is, the Turks stole my t-shirts. Now, the question is, how did I absorb that image of the Turk? In 1990, my wife and I went back to Turkey. We went for 3 days, and that 3 days changed my attitude. And that's why I applied for a Fulbright and lived there. And that's why I'm going to go back next year to do some work back in Turkey. You need to get your head hit once in a while to understand why it's wrong-headed to think that way. Now, Deepa's chat was, do Sister City concept encourage cultural exchange? Yes, indeed. That's an important part of it, is cultural exchange. But again, cultural exchange in a way is also going on by the internet. So, one of the things like we've all watched in our careers is the rise of world music, the mixture of musical styles in pop culture. So, if we're looking at boy bands from Korea, if we're looking at anything else, we're looking at a globalization of music and entertainment that is happening courtesy of the machinery we're looking at right now. And I think that really helps us.
Deepa, you joined our conversation, and it's such an honor to put your face to your wonderful email and your name. We've got the preeminent expert here on Sister Cities, and Dr. John Grabowski. I'm wondering if you'd like to share anything, Deepa, from your perspective and your rich Indian heritage.
Yeah, sure. Actually, I'm from Bangalore. So we have an organization called Kasturi Kannada Sangha, which is basically for the people from the state of Karnataka, which the capital is Bangalore. So we have this organization from 1984 where we promote our culture, our language to the kids here. So we do 4 events in a year, and whoever is here from the beginning, they participate, the young generations participate. So I was just browsing through the internet when last year I got a proclamation from the mayor of Cleveland regarding the Heritage Month, declaring November as Karnataka Heritage Month. So I got to know that Cleveland is a sister city, and Bangalore has a street dedicated to Cleveland, has Cleveland Town. So then I was just exploring, and I just wanted to know like whether it's a cultural heritage or it's just like a sister city concept. So yeah, I just got to know that we do have this cultural exchange as well.
Yeah, that's it works out. I'm just thinking one of the cultural exchanges that came from India to Cleveland, and this goes into something I've just written a book on, it's the cultural gardens. The gardens were suffering badly for a little while. And then the Asian Indian community decided to put up a garden, and it did. And you know the garden, it's on MLK Boulevard, and it has the huge statue of Gandhi. If you look at the history of the cultural gardens since then, it has just expanded. And I think it took the Indian community to say, we have a heritage, it's here, we're going to put it where everybody else celebrates its heritage, to lure in all the other groups who had come and said that they can do it too. That I think has been the turning point in that remarkable part of Cleveland.
Yeah, this year for the 75th year independence celebrations, for the One World Day, I think there were about 300, 400 people gathered there from Indian origin.
Yep.
So it was a huge crowd, and that was a significant kind of crowd that we hadn't seen it before. So every year we go for One World Day and we go to India Cultural Garden. But this year, I think it was like kind of a grand function. So
yeah. Well, it was a great post-COVID grand function.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think the cultural gardens are wonderful, and I think the more the cultural gardens get, do high culture, but also I love the statue in the Croatian of the anonymous immigrant mother. That speaks more to a lot of people who come than the heroes of the nation, I think, and that's really important. That's kind of a sidebar. But yeah, I am, as you can tell, I'm a little bit confounded by the effect of what we're doing here online with actual exchange. And as I talk about world music, I think that grows online because that's the way people consume that information now. But wouldn't it be great, if somebody is really into boy bands in Korea, if they could go to Korea and see the boy band and then absorb some of the culture that goes with it. So I'm trying to find a connection between that. And I think that's another thing, that if I'm looking at sister cities, the more we engage young people in sister city exchanges, the better off we'll be, because the young people are telling us how they want to learn, what they want to learn. And so we'll learn from them, but they would learn by going on an exchange and meeting with people from the sister city. I think that's, I'm all for youth right now.
One of my colleagues, whose name is Supriya, she's from Nepal. I know everything I know about BTS, one of the Korean youth boy bands, from her. So I think if there's an ambassador to young people and BTS, I think I happen to know her. Deepa, thank you so much.
BTS is going into the service right now.
Exactly. It reminds me of when Elvis went into the service. We're going to see what happens here. But it's really exciting. To Deepa and to John, to everyone who helped make this forum happen, thank you. I want to just say a great deal of thanks to you both, Deepa, for participating, your leadership. So excited to get together with you and talk about ways in which we can work with the dynamics and the excitement of Bangalore. Dr. John Grabowski, for everything that you do to make this happen, and in so many ways, our daily historian. To Eaton Corporation, Swage Lock, the Cleveland Hungarian Development Panel, the University of Akron, the Cleveland Rotary Club, Club, the Lithuanian American Community, Slovenian Museum and Archives, the City of Cleveland, Cleveland Public Library. We are so grateful to you. We couldn't do this without you. We couldn't do this without great citizens like Deepa and great people like John Grabowski. If you please all stick around for our last session of the day, today at 3:45, author Hema Hatanjadi will be having a conversation with Marina Marquez from the Cleveland Public Library about her book Liftoff, of the story of how she took Conserve, a small electric management company in India, to the forefront of India's energy industry. A great story for great sister cities. Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Thank you, Deepa.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone who
Thank you,
helped.
Joe.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank
Happy
you.
Sister Cities,
Bye-bye.
everybody.
Bye-bye.
Take care.